Before we get started, I wanted to situate where we are. So today is September 10th, 2014. We're at the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame with poet Dan Vera. So Dan, I just want you to start by giving us some basic information such as where you were born, where you grew up, stating your name, your full name.
Sure. Full name is Dan Vera. I was born in Kingsville, Texas, in South Texas. Spent the first few years of my life in Raymondville, Texas, and the majority of my childhood in Corpus Christi, Texas.
Okay, so give us a flavor of that childhood. What are some of your first memories? Try to engage the senses. What are some early memories you have?
Early memories that I would confuse from taking from old photographs. I really don't have many memories from Raymondville. My earliest memories are probably Corpus Christi. My father was a Methodist minister, so we grew up in the parsonage.
Who's we?
Oh, I should say, sorry. So my father was Reverendo Brigido Vera, who came from Cuba with my mother, Norma Triana Vera.
When they come out?
They came in 1962 with my brother, who was 2 years old, Joel David Vera. And the prehistory, I guess, is they came in 1962. They spent 2 years in Chicago. My older sister, Ruth Vera, was born there. And my father, having been a minister in Cuba, was looking for Spanish-speaking congregations to minister to, and found out about the conference of Spanish-speaking Methodist churches, the Rio Grande Conference, which doesn't exist anymore, but these were churches in Texas and New Mexico. And so they moved in 65, I believe, actually, by that time. And pastored very small churches in Kennedy, Texas. Carn City, Texas is near San Antonio. Kingsville, then Raymondville, and then Corpus Christi.
So your parents spent some time in Chicago before you were born?
That's right.
Okay, so we'll just touch upon that for a moment because that appears in your second book. So Chicago is part of the family lore, but not what you experienced.
Yeah, it predates me. I certainly heard stories about how cold it was, and I have a poem in the second book titled Norse Saga that speaks about that. You know, in that period when my parents left Cuba, they were the first members of their families on my father and mother's side to leave Cuba. They didn't know anybody in the United States, didn't speak English, and you had to be claimed by somebody. And the only person they knew was a Swedish nurse, which I grew up hearing stories of her, La Capitana Carson. She was a captain in the Salvation Army, and she'd served as a nurse in Cuba during the Revolutionary War. And she was from Chicago. She was from the Swedish section, Andersonville. I now know it's Andersonville. And she claimed them. And so when they arrived in Miami, there was nobody they knew. I'm not exactly sure how but they basically made their way to Chicago, and this woman found a place for them to live, found them jobs. My father worked in a plastics factory. My mother also, before she got more pregnant, I guess, also got a job in a factory. And
how long were they in Chicago?
2 years.
2 years. Yeah. And her last name was Carson?
Carson. Yeah, La Capitana Carson was how.
Do you remember her first name?
No, I should ask my mother that. I mean, I actually made a notation this morning that I should be doing some kind of praise poem to her, because she was this, you know, they just really thought the world of her. I lived in Chicago. I currently live in Washington, D.C., but I lived in Chicago before I moved to D.C. And while I was living there, I was actually there for 2 years, too, strangely enough. And my mother had a chance to come and visit me, and it had been 30 plus years since she had been to Chicago. And so she came back, towards the end of her teaching career. By that time she had learned English and had become a Spanish teacher, junior high and high school. And she came back and we were able to sort of trace the apartment building, which was still there, because all that stuff is still in Chicago, and just hear about how they struggled.
What were the circumstances? Why did your parents come to the U.S.? Was it?
Well, it was multiple. My father, being a minister, those kind of early, the stories I've heard, those early years right after the Revolution, there were serious questions about what the new government at that point, Fidel hadn't declared that it was a socialist or communist, but there were seriously threatening questions around kind of religion and my parents really kind of felt.
And your father, so back in Cuba, before they came to the U.S., he was a practicing Methodist minister there as well.
He'd gone to seminary in Cuba, and he and my mother, he was the minister, but in those days, the churches that they built, they literally built. So they have stories about my mother and dad building the little thatched house, in the small village where they started a congregation.
So you were born into a household of a Methodist minister. So could you describe a little bit, getting back to some childhood context, so you were born into a home where the family was raised Methodist?
Yeah, I pretty much, my entire family life was living in parsonages. In the not all Protestant traditions, but in my circumstance, churches had parsonages, so that was the house that the minister and his family, his or her family, lived. And so, it wasn't a house we owned. It was attached. It was usually very attached to the church itself. It was either on, behind the church.
So, do you have any early memories, and if you do, I'd like to hear about them, early memories of listening and watching your father preach?
Oh, countless. We would go to church, 2 times on Sunday. Monday night was kind of Bible study youth group, and then there was a service on Wednesday night. And so
you were in the church 2 or 3 times a week?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular memories about how he preached, his style? Was it possible that these first experiences of hearing your father preach may have been some of your first experiences with language as performance?
Yeah, certainly the preaching was part of it, but it was also the communal prayers, and I should say that this was all in Spanish, so certainly my ability to read and understand written Spanish was, that was kind of part of the experience, because everything was written, and so the bulletin was in Spanish, the hymns were all in Spanish. That was, my reading comprehension has always been stronger than mine, and I definitely sort of trace it back to, and specifically that kind of speech, certainly, there's conversational speech because we were living in the Latino neighborhood, the schools and everything. But the church experience is one of the formal language of the Valera, Bible, I guess sort of the King James equivalent in Spanish, but very formal. That sort of the beauty of that speech. And my father's preaching style was. I was commenting to somebody that, it did have a certain formality to it, but he was, he was known as kind of a good preacher who, the congregations he ministered grew, and
so certainly it sounds like in your childhood, religious practice was part of your weekly routine. Okay.
Yeah, very much so.
Let's segue into noticing your father, watching him preach, the into your school in terms of when did you discern that the written word, which would later become, your art practice, when did it become important to you? Was English among your favorite subjects or literature classes in language arts in elementary school?
Well, it's funny. I mean, that even though, I don't know, and I would probably I'd definitely credit my mother for that, but my mother was always really pushing reading, She always made sure that there were books in the house.
What kind of books were in the house?
Well, I should say my mother was also, for a period when, but she went back to school to get her teaching credentials. But basically, she opened up a daycare, and so initially, there were a lot of the books that were part of that library. So, all the sort of normal children's books that everybody has. Yeah, I mean, kind of reading was kind of something that, and reading in English was something that she thought was kind of important.
So we know this about you because of the poems in the second book. But so Spanish was spoken at home with your parents.
Yes.
English was spoken among your siblings.
Yeah.
And then English was spoken with your classmates in elementary school, or was
Well, I mean, in Spanish was definitely my first language. Logically, my father never. He always had difficulty with English and never quite learned English. My mother, learned English and went back to get her degree. So yeah, and I think among the siblings we spoke English. I think we spoke Spanish to Dad, and then we spoke English in every other context, really. I mean, unless we were, with older adults, in some church setting or some community setting. Certainly in school, and that had changed. My brother, who's 6 years older, I mean, it's amazing how things change just in that span of time. But he, his experiences of being hit in school for speaking Spanish, and
he had that experience.
Yeah, he had that experience. And what was really striking was this was in
hit by peers or by teachers?
No, by a teacher. This was actually in Raymondville, and he was hit. Basically, he didn't understand what the teacher was saying, and had basically turned to one of his classmates and asked in Spanish, "Well, what's what the teacher was saying?" And the teacher basically overheard him and hit him for speaking Spanish. Well, he went home, told Mom, and Mom, immediately marched down to the school and basically made it very clear that, this wasn't acceptable. And the teacher said, at least the way the story has been passed down to me, the teacher basically said it was the first time that a parent had basically come to sort of complain that, she didn't see that there was a problem with it. And Mom sort of made, I'm sure in whatever her broken English was, she made it very clear that wasn't going to be. But, my experience was, the bookend to that story is that I remember vividly that my first grade teacher, my kindergarten teacher, I will name her by name because I still remember, was Mrs. Farias, Nilda Farias, it was in Corpus Christi, Menger Elementary School. She was the first Latina teacher, and it was kind of a big deal, which is kind of crazy when you think about the population in South Texas. But and my father was overjoyed. I mean, it basically meant, he would always take us to class, but I remember the first day, it gave him the opportunity to basically, in front of me, tell Mrs. Farias, who was I think she was just out of teacher's college, but basically inform Mrs. Farias that, she had full authority, and if I got out of line, but I mean, that much had changed, Now, of course, it's, there was, and clearly, I remember Mrs. Farias, talking about sort of the Chicana movement. It's this kind of movement.
So, can you say a little bit about, in your poem Weedy Weedy, you talk about, the speaker of the poem talks about, en esta casa se habla español. Can you tell us a little bit about where that came from in terms of your father's desire and his general loyalty to the language and wanting to preserve that for his children in a very programmatic way, whereas we've heard stories in Texas where Spanish-speaking parents take the opposite tact because
Sure.
they associate Spanish with being punished, and therefore they want to spare their kids that, and therefore, they don't want their kids to speak Spanish. So, how do you account for that, the difference with your father? Is it because he came from Cuba and didn't have that experience, and so?
I don't know. I mean, my parents took different decisions, and they came with complications. My father decided, at some point just not to learn English, and while I could kind of wax about it being, it also presented great difficulties, certainly in my parents' relationship, and how far he was able to sort of go. But he had a great respect for Spanish. He thought it was a beautiful language. He would sometimes joke that it was a language that they would speak in heaven, so you should kind of learn it. Those kind of. But I also think he had a lot of pride that his children were learning English and were doing well in that. I think Weedy Weedy is. In many ways, kind of presents part of the dynamic of having one parent who doesn't know the language that you're most conversant in. But the other part of it is that, just as a human being, he was in his home among his family, and this conversation was taking place that he didn't get most of, And I do think that there was. I think there was some struggle at some point. I can't exactly name it, but in high school and junior high about sort of speaking Spanish. But I'm very thankful that, looking back, I'm very thankful that, I was able to kind of retain as much of the Spanish as I can. I knew a lot of peers in our generation that. Who just lost Spanish. That there's a sense of shame about it on both sides. But I think it is a byproduct of, severe hardships that they faced for speaking Spanish.
Getting back to junior high and high school, you singled out your kindergarten teacher by name. Do you have any high school teachers in mind or junior high school teachers in mind who might have been early mentors in the language arts?
Yeah, there were two English teachers. One was Cindy Wascom. She was an English teacher in high school who I remember specifically, she was teaching a section on Emily Dickinson. And just, really...
This is in high school?
This was in high school, I guess it was...
Emily Dickinson in high school.
Yeah. And she was also the faculty sponsor of the yearbook, and I was sort of in the yearbook.
What did you make of Emily Dickinson in high school?
I'm not sure that I can remember what I made of Emily Dickinson in high school. I just remember that, I kind of enjoyed what she sort of, how she played, with the language. But it's funny, I specifically remember that was one of the courses. I remember there was another teacher who did a section on Beowulf, and again it was the language work.
Do you think even that early on in high school you were thinking about writing, or did that come later?
That came later. It really came in college. I should say that one of the nice there's the oral tradition. My parents and my grandparents who came later, they would do. They could recite decimas, poems in Spanish. So, poems by, José Martí, of course, a Cuban who doesn't know José Martí is. But also my grandfather, Amado Nervo, the Mexican,
really?
He loved Nervo, And my grandfather also wrote poetry. I actually never got a chance to read it, but I remember much later, he had died by that time, when I started writing poetry, my mother and my father saying, oh, well, tu abuelo was, So the idea of writing poetry
the
wasn't
grandfather who wrote
crazy.
poetry, was this your father's father or your mother's father?
No, my mother's father, yeah. And I write about him a little bit in Weedy Weedy as well. He was somebody who was definitely an autodidact, had basically taught himself, had a huge, I've heard these stories from Mom, but basically in the farm, had a library. He sort of, kind of self-educated himself.
So
Poetry was a big part of it.
Let's transition to college, but before
Sure.
I ask you about college, do you recall ever taking a stab at writing any poems before college?
I don't. I mean,
Okay.
there might have been something in sort of class saying, but nothing.
So, in college, you mentioned earlier today that you majored in sociology and history.
That's right.
Did you take any classes in English literature, American literature?
I took
Any writing workshops?
I didn't do any writing workshops. I definitely did an English lit class, but that was about it. Yeah.
So,
yeah,
where did poetry fit in your landscape during your college years, if at all?
I think it didn't fit until I think it was my last year in college. Well, yeah, it was my last year in college. It was the break of the outbreak of the first Gulf War, although we didn't know it was going to be the first Gulf War at that point. And I honestly don't know. I mean, there's that Neruda line about not knowing where poetry comes from, but one day it sort of appears. I just remember being rocked by what was happening. I mean, the first Gulf War there was this big fear about what it was. No one knew. No one was speaking about it on my campus. And certainly, we didn't know if there was talk about a draft. I mean, there were things that sort of in hindsight. And for some reason, I chose to sort of.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like your first substantive engagement with poetry was poetry as a response to some historical.
Yeah, I mean something happening. Like current events, so to speak.
Okay.
And and it was. I haven't gone back and looked at that stuff in a while. I mean, I actually have kept journals and stuff, but I mean, I think the last time I looked at it was many years ago. It's very rhymey.
So, what years were you in college, and where did you go to college?
Went to Southwestern University, and I was there from 87 to 90. Is that right? 86 to 90.
And just for the record, what was the name of your high school?
Sunset High School. It was in Dallas, Texas. Yeah.
And what about your junior high and your elementary school? What were their names?
Elementary school was Menger Elementary School in Corpus Christi, which is still there. And, I'm trying to remember. Hamlin Junior High was my junior high school.
So you mentioned Neruda. So how else would you answer the question, who were you reading in those first early years when you began to engage with poetry? So Neruda, did you remember anyone else you were reading?
I kind of, in one of these kind of, you sort of start looking for the big books. And so I think it's around that period I started reading Leaves of Grass. So, I sort of got my Penguin edition of Whitman, and it was like sort of overwhelmed by it. I joke about, right after college, I spent 2 years doing a work service project out in Tacoma, Washington, basically doing volunteer service with Habitat for Humanity and some literacy groups. But the position allowed me to, I had a little house to stay in, and it just gave me a lot of free time to just kind of think and journal. And that's when I started getting into Neruda. I walked into a bookstore one day, it's no longer there, and I picked up a copy of one of Copper Canyon Press's, the reissues of the posthumous collections. And the book was Libro de Preguntas, Book of Questions. And I just remember being just shattered by that. There was something about that book that...
Were these dual language books?
Yeah, they were dual language. William O'Daly did the translations. And, I later joked that it was like that moment in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy lands and opens the door and it goes from sepia print to glorious Technicolor. The Neruda just... again, there was something in the language and the imagery that... so then I just had to read as much as I could. I just kind of dove in. You get into these.
And was it around this time? You're sort of giving us the context for that poem, where you go home and you speak to an uncle who asks you what you're reading.
Yeah,
poetry, and he looks at you.
Yeah, it was Tío Librado, who was teaching Spanish. I think he was still teaching Spanish. He was a high school Spanish. He was for many years in Laredo. And Yeah, so I went back home, and it was an uncle who, I don't want to say didn't have time for me, but I certainly was not the nephew or niece that he was most interested in. He would have like cursory conversations with me, and he just asked, "Well, what are you reading?" Thinking and I said Neruda, and it was like I'd said, it was just he'd never imagined I would say. So he said, "What did you say?" And then, he said, Neruda. I said, "Well, what are you reading?" And I mentioned 3 of the volumes. Remember, one was Residency, not that Tierra. And so he said, "Let me see them." It's almost like he thought I was like pulling his leg or something. So, yeah, Neruda was kind of a huge period for me.
So, I know somewhere in all this, because you mentioned it, but I want us to situate it a little bit more precisely here. You were in the seminary. Was that after college?
Yeah, it was 2 years after college. So I did 2 years out in the Northwest. And I was also, while I was sort of exploring poetry, I was really, I should say my undergraduate degrees were in history and sociology, but the university was small enough that it was really a sociology anthropology degree program. And the anthropology was what I was really fascinated by. Anyway, but I started reading, getting into a lot of comparative religion, Jung, and mythological work. And so I was just really interested in that. So I was reading that at the same time that I was reading a lot of poetry.
And so was the study of comparative religion that planted the seed, maybe, that later bloomed into wanting to go to the seminary?
Well, explicitly, because I really wasn't interested in doing ministry per se. My kind of religious beliefs were kind of all over the place at that point in time. But I actually there was someone who kind of served as a mentor for me at that time, suggested that if I was really interested in these, I was reading like Julian of Norwich and Meister Eckhart and all this kind of these mystics, so that if I was interested in that, then sort of seminary was one place that I could sort of explore that.
So the seminary was not because you wanted to become a pastor, but because it was another way of intellectual enrichment.
Yeah, it was kind of pursuing, that avenue just further.
And it was you were pursuing a seminary degree, an MDiv? Yeah,
I was pursuing an MDiv, and then the summer. Oh, so I ended up going Isle of School of Theology, which is in Denver, Colorado. I wanted to remain out west for a little bit, and I was there in the end of my first year. I also ended up coming out of the closet, and that sort of really shook up.
Was this coming out of the closet while you were in the seminary?
Yeah,
okay.
So it was the summer, the end of the summer. So that kind of derailed, a lot of plans as well. So,
including staying in the seminary?
Oh yeah. So,
okay.
But part of it too was that I think my commitments to going to seminary were always about doing service work, of some kind, and so my time in Denver was, I think I was there 7 years, and part of it was, certainly having a sense of myself and kind of a more full sense of myself.
During this whole period of time you're discussing, post-college, going to the seminary, coming out of the closet, leaving the seminary, what place did poetry occupy during that period of time?
It was really throughout all of it.
You were writing and reading?
I was writing and reading. That pretty much. Yeah.
Had you taken any sort of? Had you been part of any kind of workshop, whether formally or informally, writing group?
No. Although I was reading, I was reading poetry, and then I was reading poets on poetry. That was kind of a big.
Definitely, you would, because you alluded earlier to your grandfather being an autodidact. So would you say you were sort of in that category as well?
Definitely. I basically was a sponge. I just wanted to, grab as much as I could. And
this is a good segue to start talking about the context of how your first book came to be. Do you remember a moment or a period of time when you began to sort of think about things like sharing your work, whether in print or in public at a reading?
Yeah.
When did that sort of begin to become something to aspire towards?
I would occasionally share something with a friend or something, but I mean, I honestly don't think that like any sense of craft, any idea about that really developed until probably Chicago. I mean, I moved from Denver to Chicago and was there 2 years, and really, I mean, a lot of it really, comes with the writing community in Washington.
What were the 2 years in Chicago? What 2 years were you? When were you in Chicago?
I was in Chicago. Let's see, 1998 to 2000. So yeah.
So 98 to 2000 was when you were in Chicago.
Right.
So did you plug into any of the literary groups there, the Guild Complex?
No, I didn't. Well, I should say that my 2 years in Chicago were I was doing LGBT outreach to congregations, and I mean that was kind of one of the problems that sort of lived my experience in Chicago, which was pretty much work and go home, and I was actually traveling around the country quite a bit, so I actually didn't have a chance to explore much of Chicago, which unfortunately.
So it sounds like the poetry engine really revved up when you landed in Washington.
Yeah, well, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so talk to us about how that got started, and that'll be a good segue to lay the groundwork for what became your first book.
Well, I moved to D.C. in August of 2001, so a month before 9/11, and I was basically doing similar work to what I was doing in Chicago initially. But what really kind of moved me on poetry was, in many ways, the political response to the war in Iraq. I mean, that was kind of when things. I mean, I've been writing sort of poetry and sort of reading poetry, but it was really the Poets Against the War and the response to the
Sarah
Iraq
Browning
War.
was part of that?
Yeah, Sarah Browning had just moved. I think we moved to D.C. around the same time, and she just moved from Massachusetts and had done literary work up there, and she moved to D.C. and then immediately, or actually it might have been in 2003. Anyway, she moved there and set the first reading. We actually met at the very first reading that Poets Against the War had, and Poets Against the War was Sam Hamill and Copper Canyon Press and a couple of other people. I won't go into that. But that first reading that actually brought out over 200 people. Was a huge
Kim
turnout.
Roberts there?
I don't remember if she was there or not. I don't think she was. I met her much later.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about how you met Kim and Michael Gushu.
Yeah. So the neighborhood I live in D.C. is Brookland. It's in Northeast Washington, right next to Catholic University and the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. So I moved there, I think, probably a year after I moved there. I happened to see an email on the community listserv. Someone announcing a poetry reading by her husband, and it turned out it was Susan Gushu, the wife of Michael Gushu. And I was astounded that there was another person writing poetry in the neighborhood. So we went to that first reading. I mean, it was first for us, at the Nora School, and really, I remember there were 3 poets that night, and I was just completely, blown away with Michael's work. And so we connected up. I had actually, I think soon after that, started a group called Brookland Area Writers and Artists, and it was really just an attempt in that neighborhood to basically bring together writers and artists.
And at that point, had you met Kim yet?
No.
Still hadn't met Kim?
I still hadn't met. No, I had not met Kim Robinson.
By the way, for the record, we should also mention this as well. The circumstances that brought you to D.C. was related to Peter as well, right?
Yeah, Peter Montgomery.
So give us the story, just for the record.
Sure. I'd met my now husband in 2000, and we had kind of a long-term...
long distance
relationship. And then...
he was already living in D.C.
Yeah, he was living in D.C., long-time D.C. resident. And I basically decided to move to D.C. So I like to say I moved to D.C. for love, which people in D.C. don't often get a chance to say.
And it ended up being also a great thing for your work as well, in terms
Yeah.
of the community that you ended up plugging into.
Yeah, it was really astounding. And, I talked to a couple of those people. I feel extremely grateful to be in that community of poets. So Michael and I started a reading series for about, I think, 7 years. It was a monthly poetry series, and which, functioned in a very unique way. We occasionally had guest poets come read, and they would come and read their work. But in our idiosyncratic way, we would request that the poets, they would send us work, and if we liked it, we'd invite them. But then we would say, give us the name of 2 of your influences. And so the reading would consist of the guest poet reading their work, and then having the work of their guest, either Michael or I, or both of us, reading poems. So that was really kind of great. We always wanted to inject other poetry into the sphere. So we had a number of thematic readings, readings of works by the poet laureates, seasonal kind of readings. And what was great about that is that series ended up being an education in and of itself, because it exposed us to so many more poets, and international poets as well. We had, we did one of my favorite readings was a reading of poets who had died in the previous year, and our only limitation was work being in English. And I think all those things kind of built up this knowledge of.
And so you're talking a little bit about community building in terms of poetry series.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your thinking, and you can include Michael in this equation, of what your aspirations and beliefs were during those formative years in DC towards publishing, whether it be magazine publishing or even thinking about having a book someday.
Right. Well, as I said, we invited poets to come read, and there were a couple poets who came to read that we were kind of shocked either didn't have books out or hadn't had books out in a long time. And one of the poets that we'd invited to read was Kim Roberts. I first met Kim at a reading the day after President Bush won re-election. So I don't remember.
2004.
That was 2004, yeah.
Okay.
So I actually, unfortunately, don't remember much about that reading because I was so. But I ended up. We really loved her stuff. I heard her read another reading series, and I think we had her come back again. And so I was over at Michael Gouji's home. We were having dinner, and over dinner we started thinking, this is crazy that there are these poets that don't have books out. We should just publish their books. We should. We had no idea what we were doing.
But even at that point, at that moment, were you already beginning to send things out to magazines, either or both?
Yeah, I certainly had. I think by that time, I published stuff in Beltway. It's a area quarterly. Yeah, I was sending stuff out, not as much as I probably should have. But yeah, it's the idea of actually having, and I think we started doing small little. The group itself started publishing some smaller selections of work. But the first 2 books that we ended up publishing, we published 2 books at the same time. One was a book by Kim Roberts, her second book. She's now gone on to publish 2 more.
And that was the book that inaugurated that press, right?
No. That was Verju Press was.
Oh, Verju.
Yeah.
I'm confused.
Yeah. So we published 2 books under the Verju imprint. Initially, Hiram LaRue, another area poet, and Kim Roberts, and then we published 2 more. A poet out of St. Louis, whose name is just now escaping me, and Carol Gass, a poet from the Pacific Northwest.
Let's take a break, and
Sure.
I want you to read the Emily Dickinson poem, and then we're going to talk about how this book came to be.
Okay.
And give us the title of the book,
Sure.
the name of the publisher.
Yeah, the book is titled The Space Between Our Danger and Delight, and it was put out by Beatuck Books.
Okay, we'll talk about that after
Sure.
we read this.
Emily Dickinson at the Poetry Slam. I will tell you why she rarely ventured from her house. It happened like this. One day she took the train to Boston, made her way to the darkened room, put her name down in cursive script, and awaited her turn. Poets before her stood and rhymed, followed a meter tight and expected, outdoing one another in a monotonous clip. When they read her name aloud, she made her way to the stage, straightened the papers in her hands, pages and envelopes, the backs of grocery bills. She closed her eyes for a minute, took a breath, and began. From her mouth, perfect words exploded, intact formulas of light and darkness. She dared to rhyme with words like cochineal and describe the skies like diadem. Obscurely worded incantations filled the room with an alchemy that made the very molecules quake. The solitary words she handled in her upstairs room with keen precision came rumbling out to make the electric lights flicker. 40 members of the audience were treated for hypertension. 20-year-old dark-haired beauties found their heads had turned a Moses white. Her second poem erased the memory of every cell phone in the nightclub, and by the fourth line of the sixth verse, the grandmother in the upstairs apartment had been cured of her rheumatism. The papers reported the power outages, the area hospitals taxed their emergency generators, and sirens were heard to wail through the night. Quietly, she made her way to the exit, walked to the terminal, and rode back to Amherst. She never left her room again, and never read such syllables aloud.
Okay. Tell us about that press and how you got to be published by that press. What is it called again?
Beatuck.
Beatuck, okay.
So we had published, together we had published...
What do you mean, you and Michael?
Me and Michael Uju had published 4 books, and Michael sort of turned around and said, I mean, he sort of kind of at that point knew I'd written a lot of poetry and had published some of it. And he said, I really want to publish a book of yours. And so I really...
Yeah, what did you think when he said that?
Well, I was a little, I was daunted by it, frankly. I felt like I had a big collection of poems, and I just couldn't see an arc to them. They just felt really disconnected to me. And so for me, it seemed to be a real challenge. And so Michael said, I should say Michael, on top of being a great colleague and somebody to work with, and a fine poet, he's just a dynamite editor, and that opinion's held by many. Yeah. And he was able to sort of like find a book, find some kind of, I say, a spine, a narrative spine to that collection.
But here's what I want to get at, because what I find so admirable and outside the box and moving about the scenario you're describing. So if we transpose this to another context, and someone says, one friend tells another friend, I want to publish your book, I can envision the recipient of that offer saying, what do you mean? I want to win the Yale, I want to win the Walt Whitman, I want to publish with Copper Canyon Books, I want to submit to a poetry prize. In other words, they would think that that's not something that you would aspire to have your friend publish your book. So tell me a little bit about...
I don't know. I mean, I've never quite thought about it that way, but I mean, in telling that earlier history, though, I think, maybe my stance had something to do with that realization that Michael and I had at the dinner table, that there were poets whose work we really loved. I mean, who had just knocked us out. And I know that this is an experience many people have. You'll go to a reading, you'll hear somebody give a dynamite reading, and then you're shocked to discover, I mean, I'm thinking about 4 or 5 people just off the top of my head, having said that. You're just shocked to discover there's no book. No one's published their work. And so, for me, it's just, a book is I mean, I have great reference for a book, but to a certain extent, a book is kind of an ephemera thing. It's, but if it doesn't exist, then there's no way that people can sort of like connect to the poetry. And I think in that sense, certainly at that period, I wasn't thinking in terms of certainly prizes or, I was kind of doing readings and.
And you weren't thinking of publishing with the university press or trying to.
Not at that point. Okay. For me it was. There had been such a huge flowering of the community in D.C. and I think it was just kind of, and I also know I guess kind of through my reading, but I also know the longer history of poetry and publishing, the fact that Walt Whitman, all that stuff.
So when you accepted Michael's offer to have your book published, you were cognizant that you were part of a tradition of small press publishing.
Oh, sure. Okay. The poets that I many of the poets that I adore that sort of nurtured me, Essex Hemphill, published, just for one, but there are a number of poets whose work, was put out by, friends or small presses. I think at that point, if Michael had come up and said, oh, I want to, before we'd done anything, or before I had any sense of his editorial chops, that would have been something else. And also the fact that he was willing to invest in, putting a book out. I certainly didn't take that.
So would it be fair to say that the experience of publishing that book with Michael was a good one?
Yeah, it was great. It really...
In terms of choosing the cover, choosing the title, everything.
Yeah. No, that was a really great experience. Yeah. I should also add really quickly that so the press, his press is Beatuk Books, and Beatuk, his family ancestry goes to Newfoundland. Beatuk is the name of the indigenous people who lived in Newfoundland, and it's also the language that we have record of before it went extinct. And so there was this real sense in his efforts, and it's certainly something I appreciate, is, literally preserving language, as this kind of responsibility we have. I think there are a lot of books out there that there's work that just has to be disseminated. Sure. And I think many times people wait to sort of have it out there, not knowing that it's the first book that may lead to something else.
Yeah. So the book came out in 2009.
2008.
2008.
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason I thought it was 2009. 2009 was when I went to Guadalajara. The question I wanted to ask you, when I first told you about the Letras Latinas Red Hen Poetry Prize and encouraged you to submit, were you already well on your way to completing that second book manuscript, or did the prize sort of... tell us about how learning about the prize affected, if at all, how you put that book together.
Well, I'd known a lot of people. I'd known a lot of people who'd sort of sent manuscripts in who had to book prizes, and I knew a lot of the talk about book prizes, good, bad, whatever. Yeah. And I should say that the first book that we published, Kim Roberts, was a manuscript that had been rejected from had not won, and she'd been so frustrated, and nobody would. And so part of our response was also like, let's publish it, Anyway, I had really no sense of what a second book would be, and it actually, in a weird way, terrified me more than the first book, because I don't know where it came from, but I early on had a sense that I wanted the book that ended up being Speaking Weedy Weedy, I wanted the book to be kind of this cohesive set of poems, and so I decided that my goal was going to be, submitting something for the Letras Latinas Prize, and so
it became like a useful exercise for you. By having that deadline, that gave you sort of a benchmark to put something together, just to submit, whether you want it or not.
Right. So part of that was kind of dedicating a year. I can't remember when it was announced exactly, but I think it was a year in advance, and the deadline was in January of the following year, and that was my marker. So I remember it also meant that I did my first artist residency. I applied for an artist residency at the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, And they, fortunately, they gave me a month there. November was the November before the January deadline. And so I kind of worked towards that November away. And I think I had a number of poems and still didn't have a sense of how they connected. And that month away was just really kind of putting them in some form and then writing what was missing out of the sort of the skeletal frame of the...
I'm going to ask you to read a poem, but first, you do go over for another 10 minutes maybe? Okay. Why don't you read La Lupe, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about this book.
The book is Speaking Witty Witty by Red Hen Press. And this poem's titled, How La Lupe Defeated the Alien Invasion of 1969. In the end, it was not a virus or a cold that did them in. It was the sound that came from the upper registers of the radio dial. For with all their strange alien skill, they could not foretell the dangers hidden in the weak AM radio signals, whose transmissions never pierced the Magellanic clouds. They appeared and dispatched our planetary defenses, took the capitals of the vanquished governments, who prepared a ceremony of surrender. Dignitaries came to submit and genuflect, till on the third day the ambassador of the Bronx arrived to pay humble tribute in the form of his people's song. The perpetual glowering grins of the alien representatives flared when she appeared to serenade them. La Lupe, at the microphone, began to move, and even with 12 eyes each, the strangers could not detect how her body moved that day. The devil in her body stirred that cadera shake, which caused their tentacles to feel their first perspiration, till by the third verse the delegation was writhing on the ground. And then from the bodegas the swaying shock troops arrived, armed with the hip sway threat of street corner tabletop armories, piled high with bootleg munitions of Celia Cruz and Tito Puente. Within an hour, Mongo Santa Maria was blaring from open windows, and Walter Cronkite had given way to Johnny Pacheco and the Fania All-Stars. By the end of the day, satellites in every orbit broadcast Huaracha and Son Motuno, till every craft came tumbling down in quivering wrecks. Nothing could have prepared the aliens when the trembling came. Traveling light years in the silence of deep space had left them prone and unable to resist the corporeal quake. But having no hips, they could not shake it off and shattered themselves into oblivion.
So I noticed in that poem that you used the term cadera, which, if I'm not mistaken, aside from La Lupe's name, seemed to be the only Spanish in that poem, which contrasts with a lot of the other poems where there seems to be more Spanish. So can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at just using cadera, and then talk a little bit about how the role Spanish plays in this collection? Sort of restating some of the things you've been talking about.
Sure.
This morning in class.
Yeah. Well, some of the language is just, this is an example of it, but there was something about, of course, the poem is about a real person in an unreal situation. Yeah. But I think the Spanish I use is, I don't know, I guess it's a selective use based on the, the opportunity I have, the sort of the sound, the sound of the word itself, how it's sort of kind of the musicality within it, cadera versus, but and then of course the actual forms of music, Son Motuno and Huaracha. I think this certainly. I'm trying to think about space. I think I took the opportunity of the contest to sort of explore.
To explore what? Tell us.
Well, to really explore. So much of the book is about kind of personal family history, but then the other section of it, because part of the family history is, confronting sort of a new place, or sort of arriving in a new place, and then confronting not only kind of your own physical environs, but also sort of the cultural surroundings. And so I'm like really intrigued by, that poem's at the very end of the last section. And I do think it's that section that sort of is dealing with the larger cultural images, projections of what it means to be Latino. So, La Lupe is in there in this fantastical, false historical moment, but she's there with, the Joker and fictional characters in Star Trek. Because I think, Latinos, like many groups, I think we're constantly struggling to sort of make sense of the narrative that's presented to us in popular culture, whatever's missing, whatever's been kind of erased out. I think that's.
What do you see yourself? What areas do you see yourself exploring for your next book? And are there things that you're going to continue to explore that you've already touched upon in your second and maybe even your first book? And are there new areas that you want to try out that you haven't tried before?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until Speaking Weedy Weedy came out that I saw these linkages between poems that were in the first book. Some of them are, the botanical poems. But I also think, there's a poem in the first book around We Abide in the Irony, which is about living in Washington, D.C. as I do, and being surrounded by these monuments that concretize history, tell a certain story.
So history continues to be
history is a big subject for me. And I think the poem that's kind of the jumping off point I see is the Cuban Friendship Urn in the second book. So I'm really interested in this period in the late 19th century, actually mid to late 19th century, when the United States kind of really moved into this imperial stage, and for many Latinos now living in the United States, that's the entry point for their involvement in the United States. But also for Filipinos, there's all this stuff that sort of connects, and part of it is, in a weird way, I'm interested in the history, but I'm also interested in place, because living in Washington, I'm surrounded by all these, marble and.
Do you envision the next book project to be sort of a companion to this book, to this latest book?
I certainly see them being, in conversation with each other.
And is there stuff that you're working on that might not be part of this project, but might be another project? Well, you got an ekphrastic poetry assignment.
Oh, well, that's true. That's true. The project that Letras Latinas did with the Smithsonian, was it Nuestra America exhibit, was this great. I'd never really done much ekphrastic work, so it was really great to sort of, again, I think visual artists are responding to everything that writers are responding to, so it's great to have that sort of that dialogue, between their art, their visual art. And as somebody who does a little visual art, that's kind of something that I'm sort of really interested in too. So,
Having had this experience of publishing your book with the Red Hen Press, do you envision for a next collection to do a similar model, whether it be a book prize or having a bigger press like Red Hen do a book of yours, or do you not rule out the possibility of going back to the model that you did with the first book, or something? Have you thought about this?
I think it depends on the manuscript and the project. I certainly, I believe in kind of independent publishing, and Red Hen has been an amazing press to work with. The book being out, the reach has been great. But I also, I'm aware that there's also a long tradition of established poets and mid-career poets sort of kind of working with other presses. The fact that James Wright, had books published by smaller presses, chapbooks, I think the important thing is just, getting the work out there.
Okay, well, this has been great. Thank you for doing this interview.
Sure.
And I'll look forward to seeing it on the web at some point.
Great. Excellent.
Thank you.